Hello, and welcome back to the world of survival horror. A few years have passed since my original Resident Evil Iceberg video, and while I'm proud of that original video, I have to admit they use a lot of work. I've been contemplating the right time to make these next series of videos that I want to do, considering that I wanted to wait a while after the release of Resident Evil 8 and the Resident Evil 4 remake, and maybe even 9. Who knows? We'll see. There was also the long-awaited book called Itchy Tasty by Alex Annual, who some of you might know better as CVX Freak. Alex spent many years of his life interacting with and interviewing many of the game's original developers, those involved with the likes of Resident Evil 1 through 4, and thanks to his book, I was able to update many of my original entries from that Iceberg video, as well as include some new ones. I highly recommend that you read his book because I feel that it's necessary reading for anyone who is a diehard Resident Evil fan, even if you think it might just be some surface level information. I still feel that the book is worth buying and reading through and doesn't really go for too much money these days. Also, it would just be nice to support his work because the book has been in production for a very long time. That being said, these next few videos that I plan on making with these Resident Evil Icebergs are not here to replace any of Alex's work because he does share a lot of personal stories that are only his to tell. Plus, most of what I've already come up with have only been, if anything, enhanced by his work. I wouldn't say anything too much more new or groundbreaking, but I definitely felt more inspired to get back to working on these things. I've been playing Resident Evil since 1996, and as a result of these last almost 30 years, I have an unhealthy amount of knowledge regarding this entire franchise. So this particular video will just cover the PS1 era of the games, which are all now available on the Good Old Games Galaxy or GOG Galaxy, whatever you want to call it. There'll also be some Resident Evil Survivor on this list, but I digress. And the reason why I wanted to do it this way, because it'd be kind of easier for me to split up the eras of Resident Evil into 3 distinct eras. That way, eventually I could make a supercut and re-edit and reprocess a lot of things, as well as use some entries on this list to actually help flesh out some of the remake entries that I plan on having on the later videos. So just relax, sit back, and have fun. I don't know, whatever you want to do, as I take you through this journey down my Resident Evil Iceberg. You have once again entered the world of survival horror. Good luck. Starting with the top of the iceberg, Japanese and American title differences. Biohazard is the Japanese name for the Resident Evil series. The story goes that when wanting to release the game in America, there was already a trademark for the title Biohazard that was used by a DOS game. Upon realizing this, Capcom had an in-house contest to name the game, and Resident Evil was the name that won. And it was entered as a joke, like a funny pun, but I mean, it sticks and it's pretty cool. In my opinion, I really like the Western title. I love that we've come as far as interchanging them freely in our culture. Both titles work, so I was personally happy when Resident Evil 7 dropped and it was known as Biohazard here in the West, and then of course in the East, Japan got Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. That's really cool. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Love it, love it, love it. It was totally a full circle moment that as a fan I really loved, and of course living in Louisiana, I mean, pretty cool to have my favorite franchise visit here. So some people will say that Resident Evil in America wasn't called Biohazard due to a band with the same name, but that's neither been confirmed nor denied, as we already mentioned, the DOS game that I did before. And also quite a few trademarks of Biohazard already existed, and Capcom really wanted to set this game apart from other sources of media. Plus, not to mention that Japan and America just have very different copyright laws. So if you ever hear anyone who says that anything about the band Biohazard, be like, nah man, that's not right. This is the actual answer. And that's it. That's all there is to it. Mystery solved. Sweet Home. Sweet Home, also known as the Mamiya House, is a 1989 J-horror film that had a video game adaptation to accompany the film's release. The game was developed by Capcom, featuring a team who would help inspire the first Resident Evil game. Sweet Home was interesting because while it is a role-playing game, it also contains many elements that would later be considered survival horror gameplay mechanics, such as intense buildup with enemy encounters, limited resources, permadeath, and so on. Even the iconic door scenes in the OG RE titles looked at the door scenes from Sweet Home, but more in that detail a little bit later. I don't want to stay too long in this section, however, I do want to point out that the overall plot of the game actually expands on the film. In the game, you play as a team of documentary filmmakers who are looking to seek missing paintings from an old, worn-down mansion, but the mansion is full of monsters and constantly falling apart, as well as involving a bunch of traps that hurt and kill some of the main characters. If this plot sounds familiar to you, then you're correct to assume that the VHS tape and Super Gators documentary team and RE7 is more than likely a reference to Sweet Home. I always somewhat theorize this, and I don't see many people talking about it much, but it seems too similar to be a coincidence. After all, the whole point of RE7 was to return to the series' roots, and what's a better way of doing that than paying homage to Sweet Home, originally a first-person game. I would say it's now more commonly known that the original Resident Evil title was going to be a first-person horror game with action sequences and shooting mechanics. However, director Shinji Mikami later discovered Alone in the Dark during the first game's production, which then inspired a third-person cinematic approach to the game's design. Mikami was also quoted in saying that without Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil would be a first-person game. For those who don't know, Alone in the Dark is considered to be the godfather of horror games, and I encourage you all to check out that game because it is very cool. Jill's Sandwich. Jill's Sandwich is a reference to a line of dialogue spoken by Barry Burton to Jill from the original Resident Evil game. It is a notorious bit of dialogue that has been referenced by Capcom and a multitude of Resident Evil titles.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
It has even been referenced in Dead Rising. There are so many memes and artwork that reference this line, and it's gone down in Resident Evil history as being very quotable. According to Barry Jurdy, the original voice actor for Barry, a lot of corny lines that he read were actually written by Capcom themselves. All the voice actors read the lines as is, and nobody improvised anything. Bad voice acting. The original Resident Evil title is notorious for having very off-the-wall and poor quality voice acting. Most of the voice actors were either Canadians or Americans working in Japan at the time, which actually explains a lot of the Canadian accents you hear throughout almost every single entry of the RE titles up until Code Veronica. While I don't care about Guinness World Records per se, it's interesting to note that RE1 is in the Guinness Book of World Records for having the worst voice acting in a video game. However, I definitely know games with far worse performances. In Alex's book, Itchy Tasty, he mentions that Mikami intentionally kept the lines of dialogue very simplistic so that non-English speakers could better understand the game. This is an assumption that I had always made myself, especially since I started to learn Japanese and study it within the last few years. I will also speak about the fact that dubs were notoriously bad during the 80s and 90s. English localization wasn't very common, so I like to look at Resident Evil as just being that poorly translated localization and a somewhat relic of its time. They never cared too much about talent back in those days, for speaking English was simply enough, and for English voice actors, a job is usually just a job. However, as someone who is friends with a lot of voice actors, I do know that many of them are very passionate individuals that truly love the work that they get to be a part of. Looking at you, Richard Epcar, I miss you, buddy. There's an entire video that I want to make about the voice acting in the original game, so keep an eye out for that. The Resident Evil movies and other adaptations. The live-action RE films are notoriously bad, however, despite their quality and lackluster storytelling, people seem to actually enjoy them. Sure, let them, even if they're entitled to their own opinions that are more than likely wrong. The first 6 films were done by Paul W.S. Anderson, and they all star Mila Jovovich as a made-up character named Alice, which I wouldn't mind if they didn't try to make the films so linked to the games. While the films do eventually craft their own story, they miscast and misuse so many of the characters featured throughout the franchise. In 2021, Welcome to Raccoon City was released, and they somehow managed to make so much of it worse, and I don't wish to discuss that film any further. I will say that I don't think the CG animated films are perfect. They're far more entertaining and stick close to the source material, for better and for worse, but that's a whole other video for me to make. For as much love Resident Evil gets in games these days, there surely is a lack of good films and television adaptations. Fun fact, in the behind the scenes footage and documentary based on a DVD and Blu-ray for the first Resident Evil film, there's a video of a guy putting a PlayStation 1 disc into a PS2, I believe it's a PS2, with the wrong side facing upwards. So if you want further evidence they didn't know what they were doing, there you go. The original Resident Evil PS1 directors. I couldn't make this list without discussing these guys. Fujiwara was the lead director and producer of most of Capcom's greatest games, from Ghosts and Goblins, Bionic Commando, Mega Man 2, the guy did it all. He was also the lead director for Sweet Home, and as a result, he and his team were the ones responsible for ironing out the survival horror gameplay that made Resident Evil so memorable. Being a mentor to Shinji Mikami, Fujiwara inspired Mikami to make the scary game that would become Resident Evil. Mikami, being someone who is knowledgeable and an avid fan of horror movies and stories, was essentially handpicked to direct Resident Evil because of this very reason. Contrastly, Hideki Kamiya, who was the lead director of Resident Evil 2 in 1998, is very afraid of horror movies, hence why he strays more into action games. Kazuhiro Aoyama was the lead director of Resident Evil 3, and his story is very interesting for a lot of reasons. Namely, since Resident Evil 3 was originally going to be a spin-off, but became a main number title more than halfway through the game's development, putting a lot of pressure on he and his team last minute, and yet they still managed to crush it. Hiroki Kato is a system planner who worked on many of the puzzles and booby traps seen throughout the Resident Evil games. He was later appointed as the lead director of Code Veronica, which in hindsight makes so much sense because Code Veronica has tons of crazy puzzles and traps that result in a game over. I do want to give a special shout out to Nobuo Sugimura, for he was the man brought in to basically be the lead scenario writer for the Resident Evil games and help piece the entire storyline together until his untimely death in 2005. He was a legendary Japanese writer who wrote out storylines for multiple series like Kamen Rider and Super Sentai, the latter that all of you English speakers might know better as Power Rangers here in America. Seriously, we owe these men a lot. Tokuro Fujiwara has made two of my personal favorite games, Demon's Crest and Tomba, and I would love to make a video about him. Honestly, I would love to make a video discussing the entire dev team for all of the games. There are some of my favorite developers and have worked on my personal favorite games outside of Capcom even, and not to mention that every Resident Evil game does have an interesting development story. Keeper's Diary. Keeper's Diary is a well-known file in the original Resident Evil that can be found that contains a story about a researcher who gets infected as he slowly begins to turn. It's one of those interesting moments in the original game that, in my opinion, truly sets the mood and tone of the overall bleakness of the scenario that you as a player find yourself to be in. It's also famous for having the written line, "Itchy Tasty," which has become somewhat of a slogan for the series as a whole. The funny thing about Itchy Tasty is that the Japanese line for it is written as Kayui Uma. Kayu is a Japanese homonym that can either mean itchy or rice porridge in Japanese, while Uma is a homonym that can mean either delicious or horse. As a result, Japanese fans make fun of this line quite often and will say things like delicious horse, etc., etc. The line Itchy Tasty, as I said, left a huge impact on many players, since Keeper's Diary is just so damn cool and worth reading on every casual playthrough of Resident Evil 1. It's not a mistake that Alex Anio's book is called Itchy Tasty after all. The fun fact is that in the Japanese version of Resident Evil 1, you can actually see the file covers up close while you're reading them, and it looks as if the Keeper's Diary has a name written on the front. I can almost make it out, but it looks like to me that Keeper's name is actually Peter, or something beginning with the letter P, so you tell me what you think. Dogs jumping through the windows. This refers to the moment in the original Resident Evil where the zombie dogs, aka the Kerberos, jump through the windows. This is a moment that is probably people's first recollection of the first game. It's a moment that truly cemented RE1 as a horror game for many people. In fact, every Resident Evil game since then has some kind of window-breaking jump scare moment, such as the arms coming through the windows in the second game, or Nemesis jumping through the window in the RPD. It's a fun and memorable moment for sure. It's such an impactful moment that if you ask just about anyone who has played the original Resident Evil, even just once, I almost guarantee you that they will bring up the fact that dogs burst through the windows and it scared the shit out of them when they were kids. The Fort Survivor, or Hunk. The Fort Survivor is a mini-game in Resident Evil 2 where the player controls an Umbrella operative known as Hunk, whose job was to cure a sample of the G-Virus and take it back to Umbrella. Hunk is a very enigmatic character in a Resident Evil series since technically no main protagonist, probably outside of Ada, is actually aware of Hunk or his actions. He has a huge cult following amongst RE fans, where he isn't technically everyone's favorite, but something about his mystery and allure does draw people to him. It's funny because for all the reasons where someone like Jill or Leon might be someone's favorite character and appeal to fans, Hunk has all the complete opposite qualities of those characters, and yet people just really love him. I personally think that he's awesome. I really just don't know why either. I guess it's because of his reputation that's built in the game, as well as the fact that he's able to survive against all odds, hence his nickname Mr. Death or the Grim Reaper. What's cool is that the Japanese nickname for Hunk is Shinigami, and that's just awesome because that would mean that he's literally a god of death. It also helps that Hunk has become a somewhat mercenaries mode unsung hero because he's so much fun to play, and he's always been one of the better characters to use in mercenaries mode. His neck break is very legendary. Some people have tried to theorize that the name Hunk is an acronym that stands for Human Unit Ever Killed, but that is simply not the case. Others have maybe said that maybe he's a clone of another character, and all these other crazy weird theories, but none of them are true whatsoever. Kazuhiro Aoyama, the director of the original Resident Evil 3, actually confirmed during a director commentary playthrough with speedrunner and streamer Carcinogen that Hunk's name is a typo and that he was supposed to be named Hank. But there is no way to distinguish the English spelling of Hank from the Japanese pronunciation Hanku. So yeah, that's it. Resident Evil 2 director Hideki Kamiya has actually countered his statement. However, being that Aoyama was the guy who directed and helped to make the fourth Survivor scenario and was in charge of overseeing its entire development, I feel that I would take his word over Kamiya's any day of the week concerning this matter. George Romero. George Romero was an acclaimed and well-accomplished filmmaker who is known as the father of the zombie horror genre. His films such as Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead heavily inspired Capcom to make Resident Evil a zombie genre experience of their own. Romero was actually originally penned to be the writer and director of the RE movie before production began. I've always wondered how this film could have turned out because it's not as if it could have been any worse than what we eventually got. Romero also directed the live-action Japanese commercial for Resident Evil 2, and I'm quite fond of it. I love that the remake of Resident Evil 2 got a live-action commercial as well to pay tribute to the original game's promotions. One of my favorite things about Romero overall is that he heavily praised the Resident Evil franchise for bringing back zombie films. In fact, Alex Garland, the writer of 28 Days Later, Greg Nicotero, a famous makeup and special effects artist primarily known for his designs for AMC's The Walking Dead, and Simon Pegg, who along with Edgar Wright, had featured a now famous RE2 skit in their series called Spaced. And later on, they would go ahead and work on Shaun of the Dead, which we all know is a legendary zombie film, and all these people have praised and owed Resident Evil some credibility for inspiring their own lines of work. While it might be hard to believe now, zombie films were somewhat dead for a while before rising back in popularity in recent times, pun intended. I guess you really can't stop the undead from walking the earth. Also, I love that Romero loved Resident Evil because in a way, that's basically like Rio recognizing Rio, and where I'm from in the city of New Orleans, it's kind of a big deal. Romero unfortunately passed away back in 2017 at the age of 77 after losing a battle with lung cancer. Rest in peace to a legend. Queen references. All throughout the franchise are references to the band Queen. For example, Chris and Claire both have jackets that read Made in Heaven, which was the name of the final studio album by Queen following the untimely death of lead singer Freddie Mercury. Claire's vest in Code Veronica also reads Let Me Live, which is another song from the same album. JoJo references. This is not a troll entry on the iceberg. Capcom was always directly involved with many JoJo Bizarre Adventure video games all throughout the 90s and 2000s. There are two main characters in the first game named after JoJo characters, both being Joseph and Enrico. This was actually confirmed by Hideki Kamiya during a live stream that he did alongside Alex Aniel and also challenge runner and speedrunner Carcinogen, where Carci played through the entirety of RE2 1988 while Kamiya provided commentary revealing really cool insight about the first two RE games. And yes, I am also aware of the RE3 director's commentary playthrough as well. In Resident Evil 2, there is also a locker that reads JoJo, which was thankfully kept in the remake. And for those wondering, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is referencing Queen when they are putting the shit like Made in Heaven and the Stone Ocean story arc that was being written and put out in manga form during the development of these games. Resident Evil 1.5. RE 1.5 is the RE2 that we never got. Roughly 70% through the development of the original RE2, Capcom was not very happy with the results, so they scrapped all of it and started production on RE2 from ground zero. There are so many videos covering RE 1.5 that I might even add to that pile eventually because there is just so much that can be talked about with this anomaly of RE's history. Of course, I couldn't talk about 1.5 without talking about Elza Walker, who was initially supposed to be Rachel Spire, Forrest's sister, but that's another story for another time. The fact that Capcom included an Elza Walker costume in the remake was pretty incredible, considering that Capcom spent 2 decades never discussing or referencing 1.5 outside of interviews. It's pretty interesting stuff all around, and Hideki Kamiya, RE2's director, and yes, I also know he made Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, is very transparent in saying that the Resident Evil 1.5 build was complete shit, so take that as you will.
This is Brad. Stars Alpha Team. Please respond. What the hell? Is nobody out there?
This is Chris.
This is Brad. Stars Alpha Team.
Shooting the screen. In the first 2 Resident Evil titles, it's possible to break the screen by shooting the camera and select rooms. In Resident Evil 1, this can be done with both Chris and Jill with all of their guns except for the grenade launcher and the rocket launcher, but I haven't fully tested all that out just yet. This can also be done in Resident Evil 2 with Leon and Claire with shotguns and handgun, but I still have yet to actually go through all of Resident Evil 2 and try it out myself because I did do a video where I actually spent the time going around Resident Evil 1 and shooting it every single camera angle that I could and just trying to find where else you could do this. I don't think I've found every single place yet, obviously, but I do want to do further experimentation and might make a really cool stream to do as well. The video that I made can be found here on YouTube, and you'd be surprised how many places you can break the screen in Resident Evil 1. Door scenes are loading screens. In all the Resident Evil games that include door cutscene transitions between rooms, this is actually a loading screen that is disguised. While many people believe that door transitions exist as a homage to Sweet Home, they initially weren't going to be included. According to Hideki Kamiya, they introduced the door scenes as a means to adhere to a rule that Sony had for their games, because they didn't want the fade-out screens lasting longer than 5 seconds and games for their console without some kind of indication because test players thought that the game would freeze, so Sony required some kind of on-screen text or image to let players know when games were loading. Thanks to this, Capcom was able to include these now iconic door scenes to not only make Sony happy, but it did eventually allow them to pay respects to Sweet Home, so it was kind of a happy accident. The Resident Evil books. The Resident Evil books are a series of novels written by S.D. Perry that cover the events of the games from Resident Evil 1 through Code Veronica, although there is a book written about Resident Evil 0, but that one obviously came later and it's kind of on its own. It kind of stands alone from the other books. The books are considered to be their own canon, consisting of backstories for characters unique to the books, such as Jill's father being an ex-con and thief known as Dick Valentine, hence why she knows so much about lockpicking. Obviously, this contradicts her own canon backstory as in being one of the only women in the world that have Delta Force training. Interesting takeaway from the books is that while S.D. Perry didn't have as many resources to her disposal and writing the books, she clearly had to play through early builds or have some kind of inside knowledge from Capcom in terms of writing her own stories, because quite frankly, these novels are better adaptations of the games than the movies are. Some of my favorite aspects of these novels is that we get to witness key moments from the games from the perspective of the antagonist, and I'm all for reading the perspective from the likes of Wesker and Nikolai. Some of the character relationships are reworked. For example, Leon and Claire seem to have an actual romantic interest in one another, which truly feeds more fuel to the Redfield Bloodline fans. Yes, I'm mentioning that here, but that's going to be in the next video. It's a very interesting take on the story of Resident Evil, and they're very enjoyable. S.D. Perry also wrote some Alien Predator novels, and I encourage you all to check out her work. The books are really cheap. I've managed to pick them up all from a secondhand book store that's here in Louisiana called Second and Charles, which I know there's some locations that exist in other places of the country. And I got them all for about $2.50 each, US dollars. Brand new copies might go anywhere between $10 to $15, and that's not too bad. Resident Evil Gaiden. Resident Evil Gaiden is a very well-known spin-off title for the Game Boy Color, and it's on this iceberg because it does play a key role in the history of Resident Evil. It's an interesting game to say the least, considering that the story revolves around the likes of both Barry Burton and Leon Kennedy, which is honestly a pairing we've never seen in the mainline numbered titles before. The story is based around an SOS call sent out by Leon that Barry receives, so he journeys to the source that happens to be on a luxury cruise liner that, would you have guessed it, is now crawling with the T-virus and its monsters. The game is notable for looking and playing a little similarly to Sweet Home, and for being a strange non-canon entry in the Resident Evil series. The ending of the game even shows that Leon might have been killed off, and one of the tyrants is now taking over his likeness, so yeah, it's a pretty weird game overall. I personally enjoy playing the game because while it is at times cumbersome, it's actually kind of fun. Unfortunately, the game costs a lot of money in the secondhand market, however, but I'm sure you could all find a way to play it for yourselves. RE Gun Survivor. The Resident Evil Survivor series is another line of spin-off titles that more or less vary in quality. While many people are well aware of Gun Survivor, which is titled Resident Evil Survivor here in the West, most might be unaware that there are actually 4 games in the series, with one of the titles being a Dino Crisis game. The first game is known for its horrible voice acting performances, which are probably actually worse than the original Resident Evil game, as well as its less than stellar campaign and gameplay. Anyone can beat the game within 2 hours. Trust me, it will not take you very long. The game follows the main protagonist with amnesia, who believes that he is a villain named Vincent. Believing that he is this bad guy who has committed crimes, he eventually finds out, and spoiler alert, that he is, in fact, the hero, Ark Thompson, sent here to Sheena Island to uncover the mysteries and take on the bad guys. The funny thing about Survivor is that the game is notable for a sort of lackluster but charming quality, and at one point, Ark actually mentions that he is friends with Leon and even calls him by his full name, which is really funny. Full of cheese and charm, Survivor is a hilarious time. Code Veronica actually confirms that this game is canon, so I await the day when we finally get to have Leon and Ark team up, and it needs to happen. The Gun Survivor series is strange and they all vary in quality, and there's a surprising lack of information on their development. It's definitely something that I wish to make an entire video on because I do legally own 2 of these games, and I think they're worth talking about and showing off. Rebecca's Photo. Rebecca's Photo refers to a film that could be discovered in both Resident Evil 2 and the remake that is hidden inside of Wesker's desk. In the original game, the player can find a film that they can take to develop to the save room that contains Rebecca's photo by searching through Wesker's desk 50 times. Neki Kamiya actually stated that this is a requirement for the film because it's supposed to simulate the player looking under stacks of papers and digging through files, which I find to be pretty clever. Why Wesker has his film hidden inside of the desk is a question that many people have often asked, and maybe we should never know the answer. But in my opinion, if we are going to go off the lore and the games, I'm certain he probably had a photo of her because he is a captain. But why this photo? I mean, hey, why not? Terminator, Alien franchises. There's a lot to go through, so I'm going to only touch on a few references, like the IDs in the first game on the character select screen, the weapons, and so on. The initial plan going into development of RE2 was to make this the franchise's Aliens, assuming the first game would be like the original Alien. For those unaware, Aliens, a sequel to Alien, is far more of an action horror genre film than the pure horror sci-fi monster flick that the original film is. Sherry is a clear homage to the character of Newt from Aliens, whereas Claire is more or less Ripley in her somewhat motherly role. Nemesis pursues Jill very similarly to how the Terminator pursued and stalked Sarah Connor in the original Terminator, and that's probably one of the more obvious inspirations, and it's been made clear that Jill Valentine is more or less inspired by the likes of Sarah Connor or Linda Hamilton, who was the actress that portrayed her. Zombie Brad. In the original Resident Evil 2, if you reach the police station without collecting any items, you can encounter Brad Vickers as a zombie beneath the RPD entrance. Contrary to popular belief, you do not need to beat the game in order to encounter Zombie Brad. Check in his body upon defeating him. The player can find a special key, which can be used to open a locker in the dark room save room, and it grants special costumes for Leon and Claire, as well as a single action army for Claire. What's funny is that the key actually just drops off Brad the moment he dies, so if you decide to use a shotgun to get a headshot, you can actually pick the key up before his body hits the ground. Just a weird little detail that I've noticed after many years of playing this game. The S rank. The S rank refers to an old internet tale of people in America claiming that it's possible to get the S rank in the original Resident Evil 2, 3, and Code Veronica. However, if you know anything about the ranking system in the older RE titles, then you will know that this is impossible in the American versions of the game because this ranking does not exist. In the American versions, the ranking system goes as low as F and as high as an A ranking, while the Japanese versions have rankings as low as E and as high as S. While people claim that it's possible in the original American releases, this is simply not the case. However, the booklet for RE2 claims that the S rank does exist in the game, but it's more than likely just a result of translation errors from the Japanese booklet, and it led to much confusion, unfortunately. The game with ranking systems after Survivor and RE4 have all made it possible to attain the S rank that was only once locked in Japan. The American versions are harder. The American versions of the original Resident Evil games were intentionally made harder so that Capcom would try to promote game sales here in America so that the American fanbase would buy the games instead of renting them. Renting games is a practice that was not allowed in Japan, so game companies didn't have too much of an issue to get the Japanese gaming audience to buy the games. However, since renting was allowed here in America, Capcom would purposely increase the difficulty by either making items harder to locate, adding more zombies and enemies in weird places, tinkering with damage values, and so on. Now, keep in mind this had nothing to do with adding auto-aim functions to the game or making the item boxes connected. Those were developer-intended additions to balance the game that only made it into some regional versions. Mr. X's name. For years, fans have referred to the Tyrant in Resident Evil 2 as Mr. X, but nobody really knows why, just that we do. It seems that the earliest known usage of his moniker actually was by Palisades, the company who produced the original line of Resident Evil figures and merchandise. These boxes were labeled as Mr. X and then eventually caught on, even being used in an official Prima strategy guide for the game. This is still a mystery as in how he adopted the name, but it caught on and we still use it today. Even in the Resident Evil books, the Tyrant is also referred to as Mr. X, but Leon also goes as far as calling him Trenchy because he wears a trench coat, Tofu. This refers to a cult favorite character from the fan base named Tofu, who is quite literally a block of tofu. Tofu exists because during the development of Resident Evil 2, the devs used a white rectangular cuboid to serve as a model test in order to work out the hit detection in the game. The devs jokingly said that it looked like a block of tofu, thus Tofu was born. Tofu is also the main character of his own scenario called the Tofu Survivor, which can be found in the Resident Evil 2 original and remake games. Also, what's interesting about Tofu is that he only has a knife and healing items, and people kind of consider him as being like the ultimate challenge that you can do that's in the Resident Evil 2 and 2 remake. So the cool thing about Tofu is that while we always knew that we could beat Resident Evil 1 with a knife, Tofu was the character that solidified knife challenge runs altogether, which led to this huge, following of fans and players alike to essentially try to beat every single game with the knife as much as they could. Because unfortunately, not every game can be beaten with only the knife exclusively, especially some of the newer ones. There are certain bosses that we can't necessarily beat, but in this case, this is the legacy that he has left behind, and we thank him for it. We like Tofu. Tofu's cool. Biohazard 4 ads and Resident Evil 3. In the original RE3, there are ads in the game promoting an upcoming Biohazard 4. Not many people actually notice, but Resident Evil 4 was in development at the same time as Code Veronica and RE3 Nemesis, and all three of these games changed so much of their identities throughout the course of their development cycle. At the time, many people thought that Resident Evil 4 was coming sooner rather than later. However, hindsight is 2020, and we had to wait even longer to finally get the number 4 entry in the franchise. The Capcom times. The Capcom Times is the name of a newspaper seen in many Capcom video games, most notably here in Resident Evil 1, and we can see that the newspaper is in the intro of the live-action intro from this fictional and world publication. What's interesting about this is that this newspaper only shows up in the American versions of the game, or any version of the game that contains a censored intro, because in the uncensored version of the intro, this is actually where they show some of the gross close-ups of dead bodies that are in the game from the zombie attacks. And so this was basically just a way for them to cover all that up. And the picture of this man here is more than likely just one of the developers. The RPD bathroom. This entry in the iceberg refers to the fact that in the original Resident Evil 2, there is not a single bathroom in the police station, which led to a lot of people, including myself, scouring the entire game for one. There is a bathroom, or really I should say a toilet, and it's on the tram on the elevator where you fight Birkin before heading to the lab. And come to mention it, there isn't a single restroom in the lab either, which is truly hilarious because I'm sure these people had to go at some point, and I don't know what they had to do in order to figure that problem out. So in the Resident Evil 2 remake, they actually did add a bathroom, and they put in a first aid spray as a nice little treat for the fans who have always made fun of the fact that there wasn't a bathroom in the original game. Dario's daughter. This entry refers to a lost young woman that can be encountered in the original Resident Evil 3. Since Dario mentioned something about losing his daughter out in the city, it's still left uncertain if she's really gone or if Dario believes that she might be dead. However, upon roaming around Raccoon City, the player will see a young woman fleeing from zombies and screaming for help. Upon heading back to the warehouse, we can find that she unfortunately lost her life due to a zombie that attacked her on her way to safety. Maybe this was Dario's daughter trying to find her father, or maybe it wasn't. So it actually turns out the director of the game, Kazuhiro Aoyama, is very well aware of this theory, but he also shared his own insights saying that he wants to leave it up to the player's imagination and didn't want to really give a concrete answer, or maybe he was just avoiding it altogether, or perhaps he just didn't remember. Resident Evil Manhwa. The word manhwa is a generic word with multiple spellings that means comic. Depending on the spelling generally determines what part of the world this comic actually originates from. This particular spelling relates to the Resident Evil comics that were made in China and Taiwan. The multiple manhwa are interesting since they tell a lot of cool what-if scenarios and stories, like Birkin fighting Nemesis, and there's actually a really cool story that involves Leon encountering a liquor. There's a guy on YouTube named ScorePN, and he is probably the best at covering these manhwa, and so I will link their channel down below so you can watch their content. These are pretty rare, expensive, and apparently hard to get a hold of, so they are often considered a holy grail item for many Resident Evil collectors. The Misty Zombie in Resident Evil 2. The female zombies in the original RE2 dress somewhat similarly to Misty, or as she is known in Japan as Kasumi, but specifically for her appearance from the Pokemon animated series. When asked about this, Hideki Kamiya said he wasn't really aware of what people meant by this, so it's safe to say that he's not a Pokemon fan or really had intended to make her look like Misty. It's just something that fans realize, and ever since then we just kind of refer to this female zombie archetype as the Misty. The female zombie model is quite iconic and is recognized by many fans around the world, some saying that it's one of the more striking designs, and I understand why, because she does look really cool. What's funny is that the female zombies are kind of notorious among speedrunners because they are usually placed in locations that are very problematic for speedrunners and challenge runners. So while we do love them, there's a love-hate relationship there, definitely for sure. The Misty's a nice way to lose your run, trust me on that one. The Uncensored live-action intro. The original Resident Evil game has an uncensored intro that we never got to see in official releases of the first game here in America. It's entirely in color, shows off far more gore, and it even shows Chris Redfield lighting and smoking a cigarette. Joseph's death was far more graphic in this uncensored intro. In the American intro, you can see how they censored Chris smoking a cigarette by replacing it with footage from the intro where he reaches out to call for the helicopter. I always thought that was kind of funny because it's like, he's just smoking a cigarette, whatever, but I guess there was just rules against that at the time, even though like Metal Gear Solid Snake smokes a cigarette, but that game came out 3 years later, so Whatever, who cares? The Face in the Sky, Resident Evil 3. In the original RE3, there seems to be a face hidden in the sky. In fact, the image itself has been found. Some believe that this is perhaps Regina from Dino Crisis, but that's actually not true at all. Whether this is supposed to be a billboard or something, that's unknown, but it's clear that it's the same face of the woman on these posters that are found in the game. Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition Original Soundtrack Controversy. I know the title for this entry is very long, but all those details really do matter. Resident Evil 1 was released on the PS1 a total of 3 times. You had your initial launch version, which was the 1996 long box edition. There was also Director's Cut, which one of these versions came with the Resident Evil 2 demo. And then you had the DualShock Edition, which was the Greatest Hits version. This Greatest Hits edition not only included analog support controls, but it also had vibration, but most importantly, a new soundtrack to replace the old music. The person who was responsible for this new soundtrack was a man named Mamoru Samuragochi, and he was reportedly deaf, or was going deaf, and considered himself to be the Beethoven of Japan. This guy was and is a big deal, so what did he do? Listen to the song in the background for just a few seconds. He apparently composed this along with the remaining tracks on this soundtrack, and most of the songs are pretty bad. Some are actually good. There's some that I like the Save theme, the Return to Mansion theme, and there are some other good hits, but maybe out of 37 songs, 5 of them are good. According to both Kazuhiro Aoyama and Shinji Mikami, they both laughed at the new soundtrack and couldn't believe that this was to be included, but since Capcom already spent money paying the guy, they went ahead and used a new score. As I said, outside of a few songs, this soundtrack is mostly lampooned by the fans of the game, and this opinion hasn't really changed in the last 3 decades either. But this is just a setup to the real reason why this entry is on the iceberg. It turns out that Samuragochi was a sham. That's right, he lied and actually had a ghostwriter named Takashi Niigaki, and it turned out that he wasn't even deaf. This didn't just affect Resident Evil, but it also affected other games like Onimusha Warlords. I want to make a video about this guy so bad because I find him so interesting, and what I find even more interesting is that all this information came out within the last 5 to 6 years, so it's pretty new news altogether. However, I will point out that since then, he has seemed to be on some kind of redemption arc, so stay tuned. The Sega Saturn port. The Sega Saturn port of Resident Evil 1 is quite an anomaly, but it's mostly known for having the Tick enemy replace the hunters in the underground section, as well as Chris having to encounter 2 tyrants during the lab boss encounter. There is also a battle game, and it features a zombie Wesker enemy type that can be encountered, and he has a lot of health and he's really hard to take down. There are also other changes such as the character models, unique costumes, and so on, and I would love to make an entire video about this port alone. Halloween Horror Nights. Halloween Horror Nights refers to the famous Universal Studios amusement park attractions that take place every fall at Universal Studios. Each year, they have a select number of themes for their haunted house attractions. Resident Evil has been featured a few times here in America, and there are also countless other times where Resident Evil has served as a theme park attraction in other places. I would love to take a deeper look at all these attractions someday because I think they're very cool, but it's here in the iceberg because it's not something that's really well known. However, again, very cool, and we will take a deep dive in it sometime on this channel. Jill's boyfriend. This entry refers to a photo that the player can interact with on Jill's desk in the STARS office in the original Resident Evil 2, where both Claire and Leon comment that perhaps the man in this photograph is of Jill's boyfriend. According to both Aoyama and Kamiya, the man in this photo is no one in particular that we as players are supposed to be aware of, and so it's assumed that both Claire and Leon could actually just be mistaken, and assuming that this man is Joe's boyfriend. Yes, I know it's a dog in the remake. An iceberg cover in the remakes will come later on. Akuma and Resident Evil 2. In an April edition of the magazine Electronic Gaming Monthly, or EGM, they featured a hoax that mentioned that it was possible to unlock Akuma, or as he's known in Japan, Goki, from Street Fighter as a playable character in the original Resident Evil 2. This was clearly a joke, but it didn't stop people from believing it. EGM claimed that you could unlock Akuma by entering his name in the computer in the lab in both scenarios, or you had to beat the game a total of 6 times with just a knife and a handgun while achieving the highest ranking. Since I started writing and making this video, the wonderful mods and devs of Biorand have finally put Akuma into classic RE2, and it's an absolute blast to play. The original game's box art. Some people have wondered who the hell is featured on the cover of the original Resident Evil game, and it turns out that it's just nobody in particular. Artist Bill Sakanovics, who actually tweeted out saying that, tweeted out saying that the character isn't based on anyone in particular. The game was still deep into development when the box art was commissioned, so he was just told to include someone holding a gun and enemies around there, perhaps in like spiders, and just put the guy in some kind of military like outfit, and that's the box art that we got. It's not Chris, it's not Richard, it's not Brad, it's not anyone at all from the game. It's just generic military cop guy with a shotgun and there's spiders. That's it. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding the first game, and it truly just had the simplest explanation. RE1 original actors and the voice actors. For the longest time, the original actors and voice actors for the original Resident Evil 1 were left unknown. However, over the years, fans of the series have been able to locate the actors and even interview them, but mostly just the live action actors. It turns out that most of the actors had no idea that Resident Evil was going to be as big as it was, nor were most of them even aware that the project they were on was even Resident Evil, because when they got their call sheets, it was just called Biohazard. So none of them ever pieced this together, and this is something that they've all shared in common if you actually watch their interviews. They've only recently experienced that this has been such a global phenomenon for years in recent times. If you're unaware, most actors really just do their jobs and they aren't always fans of the media that they participate in. So it makes sense why they wouldn't know shit about Resident Evil, like, honestly enough. What's funny about this is that none of the actors were aware as to why their last names were omitted from the ending credits, and coincidentally, this very omission is what made the actors hard to find to begin with. The Residents of Evil, a channel that's here on YouTube, has some great videos featuring the live action actors who portrayed Chris, Wesker, and Barry, also now Rebecca, and you can watch it all here on their channel, and I'll make sure to put links in the description below. I would also like to point out that Inez and Jason, the actors portraying Jill and Joseph respectively, have yet to be interviewed by the time this video was released. As of currently, Sam Scott, Dr. Raichi, and Fred Fauché, who are all RE superfans, have worked very hard to reach out so that we could potentially see an interview with the remaining actors, and maybe even some of the voice actors. Now, I do actually have some thoughts of all this matter. I kind of find some of their claims to be a little sad and upsetting, because it turns out they weren't paid very much, although now, obviously, they appreciate what it is in hindsight, but it's just very clear that their agencies were just kind of exploiting them at a young age as just being these people from parts of the world who all decide to be in Japan all at the same time. A lot of the actors have a heavy profile of work that's under their belt that you can actually watch for yourself, and some of them even participated in other things like karaoke videos, commercials. I mean, now this is how we were able to really track them down, because of their other work. My favorite thing about all of this actually is that the actor who portrayed Chris, his name is Charles Kowalski, I think that's how you say it. He at one point lost his passion for acting, and because he's been rediscovered, he has actually been on this role of finding his love and passion for acting again, thanks to all of this being figured out in recent times. And we really owe a shout out to the Residents of Evil for allowing them to have a platform so they could speak about all of this and things that fans have wanted to know for years. And please go and support their causes, go meet them at conventions, I can't wait to meet these people myself someday because they seem like the nicest group of people. I just want to hang out with them so bad. I really do. They just seem like so cool. I would love to make a video about this as well, but just, I'm excited. Leave me alone. Stop looking at me. I don't want to be seen anymore. I won't let this end as a dream. This is the Japanese song featured in the original Biohazard during the ending credits and even the initial advertising for the game. The song is a 1996 single that was performed by Fumitaka Fujigami. When bringing the game to America, this song was not featured in the international releases. Some think it's due to license agreements, however, based on current information, it seems the song was just used in the game without the producer's permission, perhaps why it was removed when releasing the game internationally. If you listen closely, however, during the American version's game's ending credits, you can actually hear the opening of the song during the ending. I'll let you take a moment to hear it for yourself. The credit song was replaced by Still Dawn when released internationally. Also, I want to point out that the Japanese version has a very different intro song, and I love it because I love the, like, I've got a shotgun, boom. It's awesome. I don't know why I love it so much, but I don't know. It's pretty cool. Whatever. I like it. Who cares? I don't want to admit it, but I admit it now. I love the fucking Japanese intro theme and ending theme, like, so much. Jill's Diary. Jill's Diary is a file hidden in the original Resident Evil 3. It can only be discovered if the player finds every file in the game in the sequential order, meaning that the way that the game intends for you to discover them. Since finding Jill's Diary can be easily missed, it's a file that most players will overlook or may never even find on their own without a guide. I have met many RE fans who never knew the file ever existed due to the cryptic nature to obtain it. RE3 Epilogues. After completing the original Resident Evil 3, the player can unlock multiple epilogues to fill in details following the events of Resident Evil 3 for individual main characters, including the likes of Chris, Jill, Leon, Ada, and even Sherry. The epilogues clearly were included in order to allow fans of the series to learn about what to expect from the future of Resident Evil, since the time that RE3 was being developed and released, Code Veronica and RE4 were already in development. The only way to get all the character epilogues is to replay through the same file and beat the game multiple times through New Game Plus. Although I am unaware of who actually put the epilogues together, I imagine it had to be one of the lead scenario writers, including Sugimura himself. Operation Watchdog. Operation Watchdog is the name of the covert operation that Nikolai, as well as other Umbrella lead spies and informants, were all a part of during the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3. Umbrella sent mercenary units into Raccoon City following the outbreak simply just to cover their traces. The company masqueraded under the guise that they were sending in their best soldiers to clean up the mess and to prevent the outbreak from leaving Raccoon City. However, their true intentions were to eradicate any evidence linking them to the outbreak, as well as to remove or kill any remaining STARS members while collecting battle data from the people engaging with the BOWs. There was an unwritten rule in Operation Watchdog that Nikolai himself realized that only one person needed to be part of the operation in order to report to Umbrella about their findings during the outbreak. So Nikolai went on a killing spree, aiming to take out anyone who was part of the operations so that his pay cut would be much larger. This operation explains why Nikolai was present throughout much of Resident Evil 3 without being too removed from the events that kept the story flowing. There's a lot that could go into this, and I wouldn't mind making a video specifically about Operation Watchdog and Nikolai himself, because he is one of my personal favorite villains in the entire franchise. Cancelled ports. There are plenty of cancelled ports of various Resident Evil titles. Most of you might already be aware of the unfinished Game Boy Color port of Resident Evil 1 that was 90% complete, or the really horrible Tiger Electronics port of Resident Evil 2. While most of these ports were never released in official capacity, some are still available to play through emulators. They are really interesting considering that there are more or less a what-if scenario in terms of the development history and journeys of various Resident Evil games in their ports. Edward's Hand. In Resident Evil 1996, Joseph discovers a severed hand still holding onto a handgun. This hand was meant to belong to Edward Dewey in the original N64 version of RE0. However, this was clearly retconned to fit the intro of the Resident Evil remake, since Joseph does not discover the hand while looking for Bravo Team. Thus, Edward in the final version of RE0 never lost his hand. But if you look at the N64 prototype build of Resident Evil 0, you can clearly see that Edward is missing his hand, and they were trying to make the connection here so they could better fit the narrative of Resident Evil 1 original. Sengoku Biohazard. Sengoku Biohazard refers to the fact that Capcom once contemplated making a Resident Evil game that took place during the Sengoku period of Japan. Basically a time during the civil wars and samurai. The idea of the game was that an ancestor of Chris would be taking out zombies, etc. Eventually, the plan for this game soon evolved into becoming Onimusha, hence why Onimusha and Resident Evil do have a lot in common. I also find this to be pretty interesting because this would confirm that in some way, more or less, Chris and Claire must have some kind of Japanese lineage or ancestor to some degree, assuming if they had to flesh out this story even further. The Coca-Cola vending machines. In the original release of Resident Evil 2, the player can find vending machines that closely resemble Coca-Cola machines. Thanks to recent upscaling HD projects to enhance the visual fidelity of the classic RE games, as well as developer interviews, we can confirm that these vending machines do, in fact, read as Coca-Cola. There was some fear that the Coca-Cola company might come after Capcom since the logos look so similar, so in re-releases of Resident Evil 2, basically the DualShock Edition and onwards, the Coca-Cola machines, or Cool-Cola machines rather, were all replaced with generic looking vending machines. Another fun fact about the vending machines is that the Japanese dev team wasn't sure how American vending machines looked like, so in the RE2 re-releases, the generic vending machines more closely resemble those that you would find in Japan. What does the G virus stand for? While we all know what the T virus stands for, and if you don't, it means tyrant virus, a lot of people don't actually know what G virus stands for. Thankfully, I can tell you. The G in G virus stands for Golgotha, which could allude to a few meanings. Golgotha, or also known as Calvary, was a site located immediately outside of Jerusalem, which was a site where Jesus Christ was crucified. I'm not going to turn it into a Bible discussion, I'm just reporting my findings. What does this mean in context to the G virus? Well, it's possible that it can allude to the G virus rising on top compared to the T virus in terms of Birkin wanting to make the ultimate virus in order to make the ultimate weapon. Perhaps it can be symbolism of Birkin being killed and reborn, much like Jesus himself was in the Bible, or maybe I'm overthinking it. However, with Japan being genuinely interested in Christianity and making a lot of stories based on the Christian Bible in general, perhaps this isn't too far from the truth. The antidote for the G virus is called the devil after all. In the making of this video, I revisited the Resident Evil 2 director's stream featuring Carcinogen, Alex Annual, and Hideki Kamiya. And Kamiya actually stated that yes, G does in fact stand for Golgotha, but one can also think of G as in standing for God himself. Since there were rules that religious entities or references couldn't be made in older games, they had to remove any and all references to Golgotha or God in the game, which explains why they just simply call it the G virus. Super Herb Mix. The Super Herb Mix was a sort of urban legend in the classic Resident Evil trilogy. People were left to believe that mixing a green-blue mix with a red herb would grant the player temporary invulnerability or an increase in defense for a small period in time. While it was an internet rumor that led nowhere, the Resident Evil 2 remake did include a defense boost if combining a blue herb with a red herb, making this once internet myth come full circle. The original STARS team. Resident Evil 1 had a lot of early development elements that never came to fruition, and that includes the original STARS team when the game was going to be less horror and more comedic. One of the original members was a big guy with super strength, and there was also a very comedic character inspired by Eddie Murphy. It would have been interesting to see how the original team would have played out, but Interesting enough, it seems that the Eddie Murphy character is who later inspired Rick in Dino Crisis. Marvin's mistranslation and Resident Evil 3. In Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, the player can encounter Lieutenant Marvin Brownell in his office while he lies unconscious on the floor. The Japanese text mentions that Marvin is simply resting and that Jill should leave him alone for now. However, the English text makes it more ambiguous, assuming that Marvin might actually be dead. This was actually discussed by the director of Resident Evil 3 during Carcinogen's RE3's director commentary stream. It's not a continuity issue, but simply a translation issue. And there are people who have wondered about other continuity issues that actually occur in RE3 thanks to the events of RE2, such as the boarded up doors. But Aoyama has stated in that same exact director's commentary that the boarded doors is meant for you to assume that perhaps at the time there are survivors who were present there. The crushed can in the RE2 intro. In the original Resident Evil 2, the game opens up with an FMV that shows a white can being stomped on with the Umbrella logo printed on the side. If you pay attention to the intro, however, you might notice that the Capcom logo actually transitions into the Umbrella logo. Originally, this was meant to be the Capcom logo, but higher-ups of the company didn't appreciate seeing the Capcom logo being crushed on, so it was then replaced with the Umbrella logo. This was explained by Hideki Kamiya during the RE2 director's commentary stream with Carcy and CVX Freak. The Resident Evil 2 movie role contest. The original RE2 included promotional material that involved a contest that someone could win in order to be in an upcoming Resident Evil movie. To my knowledge, I don't know of anyone out there who ever came forward about winning the contest, and there's no telling if the contest had ever actually taken place. This is one of those mysteries that we might never know the true answer for, but I'm hoping this video gets enough views to potentially find the contest winner and if they were ever in any of the Resident Evil movies. The Lost Resident Evil 1.5 Prototype. This refers to a long and tiring journey involving Resident Evil fans and a guy who had practically held the RE 1.5 prototype build hostage. There exists PS1 disc of the RE 1.5 build in its most complete form. One of the owners of the disc had lost possession of this item, which I believe it's when he passed away, but I need to re-up my sources there. But many of his belongings were sold away in an auction. One of these items happened to be this prototype build of RE2, and when all parties in his crazy story were made aware, it culminated into an uphill battle of trying to obtain this extremely rare PS1 disc. YouTuber Justin Whang made an incredible video talking about this story, and I will link it down below for all of you to watch. I may also make a video myself discussing the matter, because I do have my own personal feelings about it, so stay tuned. Character name origins. For years, people have wondered where the names of our favorite characters originate from, and while there are some obvious JoJo references here and there, it turns out that the person who had the most influence in naming the characters was Hideki Kamiya. With that in mind, Kamiya mentioned that most of the names of the characters actually were inspired by adult film stars and some more inappropriate adult media. Take that as you will. The lost Japanese voice acting for RE1. There does, in fact, exist voice recordings of the original Resident Evil with Japanese voice actors, and according to Shinji Mikami, he felt that it was just unrealistic for the American characters to be speaking Japanese, so he decided to scrap it. However, you can actually find it online and listen to it, and honestly, it's pretty good. Arklay or David. Arklay or David refers to a test pilot of a Resident Evil television series that was basically going to be Law and Order with zombies and monsters. Unfortunately, it was too good, so it never greenlit. Despite all the insane amount of media we have received when it comes to Resident Evil, it's insane to me that we never can have something live action with the words Resident Evil in it and have it be really good to some degree. You can watch a small short film called David online, and I highly recommend that you do because you'll be as disappointed as I am. The pilot had special effects, a great atmosphere, and it legitimately felt chilling and scary. It's a shame that it will probably never see the light of day. Now, thankfully, in recent times, the Residents of Evil on YouTube, those guys have been working with the director of the person who made the short film, which I meant to say Dave, it's called Dave. This is me recording after the fact. They actually have been working with him to make a few short films on their channel, one called The Keeper, starring the original Chris Redfield actor himself, our boy Charlie in the lead role. Go check them out and support their fan work, please, because it's very, very good. The real life photos in Resident Evil 2 and 3. In Resident Evil 2 and 3, there are tons of photos of celebrities, and nobody has any clue as to why. It just seems weird that we can discover loads of images from movies and magazines alike, and have no sense of context in the world of Resident Evil. That being said, perhaps it's simply just a bunch of developer inside jokes, or just placement holders to some degree. The most known photo is the one from Back to the Future Part 3. The original devs never visited America. This is interesting to think about, considering just how much RE2 and 3 does a fine job in reproducing what cities in most of the Midwestern America actually look like. Although the RPD itself takes a lot of liberties in its design to fit a narrative surrounded by game design logic, the actual city of Raccoon looks pretty damn American. It turned out that the devs mostly used photos taken by their friends and family members in order to create a Midwestern American town. In my opinion, I feel that they nailed it despite never coming here at the time of development. This also led to the miscommunication of Sherry's school uniform because I didn't know what uniforms kids wore here in America when attending school. It's funny because I never ever see people really questioning Sherry's Japanese school uniform, but in a weird way, it's kind of a very iconic look that we just accept it as for what it is. Last but not least, the final entry on this iceberg is Resident Evil Childhood. Resident Evil Childhood is a home movie by three brothers when they were little kids. The movie tells their own story of Chris and Leon teaming up, trying to survive, and uncovering the mystery behind the zombie outbreak. It's more than likely that this movie is the very first fan film ever made about Resident Evil, and it's truly amazing and remarkable at how much better they are at capturing the source material. I bought the film myself digitally from Amazon for only $1, and I highly encourage you all to check it out for yourselves and support the movie. The film itself was something that they made when they were little kids, and roughly 20 years later, give or take, they discovered it and decided to upload it and upscale it for all of us to see. And for the price of $1, I'm telling you, it is well worth your time. The movie is only like 45 minutes long, and it's just so adorable to see these little kids role-playing as the characters and also zombies. And please go watch it. It's so good and so charming and so silly that it will make you remember all the times that you yourself and your friends probably role-played and dressed up as the characters and did all these funny, crazy things yourself. And I'm just throwing this out there as a kid, and I wouldn't even say I was really that much of a kid. I was 13, 14 years old at the time. I was like 13 or 14 at the time. Right after Hurricane Katrina, I live in New Orleans, hello. And me and my friend Jesus, we would like hop on buildings and pretend that his brother Liamsey was Nemesis. Like, it was a whole thing. And it was so much fun. And so me watching the film definitely allowed me to relive a lot of my own childhood memories of Resident Evil, which is why I think you should all give it a go. And it's such a niche little piece of Resident Evil fandom that I definitely knew it had to be the last entry on this iceberg no matter what, and it's such a nice little positive thing to end on a high note with. So this concludes the end of this classic era Resident Evil iceberg. That's it. I hope you enjoyed. I want to thank everyone for watching, but before I go, I do want to say a few things. First thing is that the classic Resident Evil trilogy is available for PC right now on Good Old Games Galaxy. You can get all three games for $24.99 at a bundle. It could be on sale still by the time I'm saying this, but they're $10 each individually. They work well, they play well, and they're a great way to experience these older games. And there are tons of really other cool mods and stuff like that that exist. But if you want to support Resident Evil, you can do so now. And also, I love Resident Evil, man. This is like my favorite franchise. This is like my favorite thing to do. It's my favorite like hobby of mine is Resident Evil, like studying it and getting some toys and the games and collecting cool stuff from all this franchise. You know, it's something that I just really love to do. And I just wanted to make something to put out there for all the fans like me who just want more of this really cool thing that exists. So thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. I do stream on Twitch, and I plan on multi-streaming here through YouTube as well, especially now starting here in 2025. That's what I plan on doing. So if you want to join a discussion, come see me, whatever, do whatever I'm doing. I don't just play Resident Evil on Twitch, but I also play other games, and Zelda especially. You know, I'm here for the discussion, so if you want to comment down below, if you feel like subscribing, that's cool too. If you don't like the video, dislike, tell me why you don't like it. I just want to talk about anything related to this franchise, and I'm all ears. I just want to put this beacon out there and just hope it gets the right people. Also, just want to say that any and all views that help me get revenue here, it allows me to go to college, it allows me to feed my family, it allows me to do things that I really need to get done. So I appreciate your time nonetheless. And the last thing I want to say, it's more on a serious note, but there is an incident that did take place here in New Orleans area that some of y'all are going to see. Most of y'all will see because it's going to be international news, but it's mostly national news currently. But the FBI are involved. For those who know, there was a planned stuff that took place and people got hurt. Some, unfortunately, no longer with us. And I just wanted to talk about it just a little bit and let you know that I'm okay. My friends and family are okay. I was nowhere near it when it happened. It happened miles away from me. And I'm safe, I'm in no danger, and I'm sure some of y'all will realize, because I do mention throughout this video that this is where I'm from, and this is where I live, so just know that I'm okay, and just thank you so much for your time, and I just hope you all can live happily regardless of this unfortunate start of the year, and just try your best, just do what you can, and just get out of bed in the morning. It's very hard to do, I know, trust me. And I just want you all to know that we're here. So let's make the best of it. Go do some positive things. I just want to try to put a positive message out there. And that's basically it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Go out, have an amazing day if you can. Have a beautiful life. Do all the fun stuff. And I'll see you soon because more of this is coming. So peace.
Select your hero.